Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. Continue the NFL draft conversation, but I want to do it in a little bit of a different way. I don't want to do the thing that everybody else is going to do on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday after the NFL draft, which is try to make declarative statements about what we saw in the NFL draft Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Because look, it's one thing to kind of grade teams or talk about teams after the first round, because at the end of the day, you're looking at the best players that are going to make the quickest impact for the teams that need them to step in and play right away. We know that, you don't draft, say, Jamison Williams if you're the Detroit Lions unless you plan on playing him right away. You don't draft Garrett Wilson unless you need him right away if you're the New York Jets. Why I don't want to do the grades and this and winners and losers from rounds 2 through 7 is because it really is a total crapshoot, right? Like, we do know that at the end of the day, there's going to be Hall of Famers and great players and Pro Bowlers coming out of rounds 2 through 7. We just don't know who they are. Because if we knew who they were, they would have gone in round 1. So rather than do the Seattle Seahawks, let me tell you, nobody was better on Saturday than Seattle. Miami Dolphins, love what they did in round 4. The Houston Texans, I'll tell you, they sure were better than the Pittsburgh Steelers on Friday. That's not what I want to do. What I do want to do is instead do something different, do something what I think is interesting, and that is look at the college, look through the lens of the NFL draft to a college football perspective. And what I mean by that is now that the NFL draft is done, we have real concrete data about college football. This school had the most picks since this conference had more picks than that, this school didn't have any picks at all, and what does it all mean? And what I do think we can do is take the data that we got from the NFL draft over the weekend and make some real declarative statements on college football. What we saw last year on the field in college football, what is going on right now in college football, and then, frankly, what may even happen in the future in college football as well. And so after the draft, I came up with 6 things that I learned. I might add a 7th or 8th once this thing gets going. Who knows? But I came up with 6 things that I definitively learned about college football through the NFL draft, and I do want to talk to you guys and girls about that right now. The first thing I learned, I don't know if this 2021 National Championship Georgia team was the greatest team of all time, or if they're even in the conversation. But what I do know, they may have had the best defense in recent college football history. So first of all, now that we're talking about Georgia, for maybe the final time ever, certainly about the final time about the 2021 Dogs, let me say, how about my Dogs? How about my Dogs? Georgia had 15 picks in the 2022 NFL Draft. That is an all-time record in the history of the Common Draft era. The previous record, 14 picks by the 2004 Ohio State Buckeyes, 14 picks by the 2019 LSU Tigers in the 2020 NFL Draft. So we had never seen one college in one season produce more than 14 picks until this year with Georgia. Now, are they an all-time great team? I don't know if that's fair to say, and I'll tell you why. Usually when we talk about all-time great teams, we talk about dominance really on both sides of the football, right? What made that LSU team a few years ago so special was the talent that they had on offense with Joe Burrow, with Jamar Chase, with Justin Jefferson, with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, with all the talent that they had on defense, which was great as well. K'Lavon Chase in round 1. Grant Delpit was really good. I mean, you go on and on down the list. Patrick Queen was excellent off of that team. Derek Stingley was on that team. He just got drafted this year. And so I bring it up because that LSU team was historically great because they were great on both sides of the ball. The 2001 Miami Hurricanes. Listen, I know they had Ken Dorsey at quarterback, but when you have Willis McGahee, Andre Johnson, Jeremy Shockey, Frank Gore, Clinton Portis on your offense, that's an all-time great offense, coupled with an all-time great defense led by Ed Reed, Vince Wilfork, Jonathan Vilma, etc. This Georgia team, I don't know if they're an all-time great team just because I don't know if offensively they were as dynamic as some of these other all-time great teams. It's no disrespect to Stetson Bennett, but they probably didn't have an NFL quarterback under center. And so when you didn't have an NFL quarterback under center, you relied on the run game, you whatever, this, that. So I don't know if they're going to go down as an all-time great. What I do know is they had maybe the greatest defense that we've seen in like a decade plus in college football. I think one of the great defenses that we've seen, period. First of all, just the numbers from last year back it up. Allowed 10.2 points per game. Now, I do understand, gave up a lot against Alabama in that SEC championship game, but they obviously got their revenge against Alabama. And if you look at the 10.2 points per game allowed, in the modern era of college football, that is absolutely incredible. First of all, it's the fewest points allowed since Alabama in 2011, so fewest points allowed in a decade. But then on top of that, think about how much college football has changed in the last decade compared to what it is now. With the spread offense, with the speed, with the tempo, with everything that is happening in college football, Georgia allowed 10.2 points per game, and that was reflected in this NFL draft where you had 5 Georgia players go in the first round, the first time ever we've seen 5 players off one defense go in the first round. Travon Walker went number 1 overall. Jordan Davis went to the Eagles. Devontae Wyatt, Quay Walker went to the Green Bay Packers. And then finally, the last pick of the first round, Lewis Cine, a safety to the Minnesota Vikings. So 5 picks overall. This is how good the defense was. When we talked about how great this Georgia defense was, we never mentioned a guy named Travon Walker who went number 1 overall. So you talk about a historically great defense. We didn't even talk about the number 1 overall pick. 8 players total were drafted off of this defense, and I think what's especially worth noting, it's not as though they were all draft eligible. Just for fun, I went back and I looked at some of the early 2023 NFL mock drafts. You know who is pretty much universally going in the top 10? 2 Georgia starters from last year on the defense. Keely Ringo, cornerback. Jalen Carter, linebacker. Neither was eligible for this draft. So you talk about an all-time great defense, 8 guys drafted, 5 in the first round, number 1 overall, plus at least 2 are probably going to be taken in the first round, probably in the top 15 next year. So shout out to Georgia. How about my dogs? That is a great, historically great defense that we just saw this past season in college football. You know who wasn't historically great? How about the Texas Longhorns? So I don't know if you guys and girls saw this, but Texas had 0 players drafted in the entire 2022 NFL draft. 0 players for a program that is in maybe the most talent-rich state in America, plus has the biggest boosters, best resources, best facilities, the most money pumping in. 0 players. As I just said, for comparison's sake, Georgia had 15 players drafted in the first round. They had 15 players drafted overall. Texas had 0. And you can sit there and say, well, Georgia just has definitively better players. Well, I went ahead and looked it up, and that's not necessarily the case. Georgia on Sunday, I actually tweeted this out. It got some traction. On Sunday, I went back and looked up the 2018 and 2019 high school football recruiting classes, okay, to compare Georgia to Texas, to compare the team that had 15 picks to 0. Because ultimately, the 2018 and 2019 high school classes are very important for a simple reason. Those were the guys that were juniors and seniors this year. And so I think the logical thought would be Georgia had 15 guys taken, Texas had 0. Texas probably just had a couple down years in recruiting. No. Georgia in 2018 had the number 2018 had the number 1 recruiting class in college football. In 2019, they had the number 2 recruiting class in college football. Texas in 2018 had the number 3 recruiting class in college football. In 2019, they had the number 3 recruiting class in college football. So you're talking about back-to-back top 3 classes produced 0 players. Now, in their defense, they had 3 players taken last year. Some of those guys were from that 2018 recruiting class. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about 2 top 3 classes producing 0 draft picks, that is absolutely insane, and it doesn't even take into account when I look at Georgia, all 15 of the guys that were picked by Georgia were not from that 2018-2019 class, but most were. And on top of that, there's a couple other guys that were drafted last year as well from Georgia, and a couple guys that actually were part of those Georgia classes that got drafted after transferring. So on top of Georgia having 15 guys drafted, never forget, Jermaine Johnson, who was the guy that got drafted by the Jets in the first round, started his career at Georgia. Never forget, last year, Justin Fields started his career at Georgia. So you're talking about between the 2018-2019 classes, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-plus players that have been drafted by Georgia and that will be drafted by the end of next year. Texas had 0 in this class, 3 last year. It is insane, and I cannot think of a single program in college football. I can't even think of anybody close to wasting the talent that Texas has. Perfect combination of bad coaching, bad whatever, plus awful development. 0 players taken from back-to-back top 3 classes from Texas. That's inexcusable, and that's how you know that the Texas program is a mess, as they went 5-7 last year. I will say, while Texas was disappointing from the draft perspective, I think the combination of on-the-field product with the NFL draft, LSU is right behind. So here's a crazy stat for you. Here's a crazy stat. I just said Georgia set an all-time record, 15 guys selected in the NFL draft. That's the most all-time. You know who was number 2? Wasn't Alabama. Wasn't Michigan, who made the playoff. Wasn't Cincinnati, who made the playoff. Wasn't Ohio State. It wasn't Clemson. It wasn't USC. It certainly wasn't Texas. It wasn't Oklahoma. The number 2 most drafted players in the 2022 NFL draft was the LSU Tigers. LSU finished with 10 total picks in the NFL draft, second only to Georgia. And so I don't think you can say they were more disappointing than Texas. Texas going 5-7 in the Big 12, which isn't very good. LSU going 6-6 with 10 guys that got drafted is pretty bad overall. And then never forget, it's not just the guys that got drafted, but it's all the talent across that program throughout the last season. Never forget, there were guys much like Georgia that weren't even draft eligible this year that are very highly coveted NFL prospects. So maybe the top wide receiver in next year's class outside of Jackson Smith and Jigba at Ohio State is Kayshon Boutte, my boy, love his name, who's at LSU, not even eligible this year. Top corner in next year's draft might be Eli Ricks, who transferred to Alabama from LSU this year. So you're talking about 10 guys that were drafted this year, including Derek Stingley, number 3 overall, plus 2 more that are probably going to go in the top 10 next year that were on LSU's roster. You talk about an utter waste of resources, an utter waste of talent. LSU isn't worse than Texas, but they're pretty darn close. It also makes me think 3 things definitively about LSU as we look ahead and look back on college football. 1, I just told you, that 2019 LSU National Championship team had 14 players selected. This one had 10. So when you really look at it from an NFL draft perspective, the talent gap isn't that big. Now, obviously, LSU had 5 first-rounders that year, 1 first-rounder this year, so it's a little bit of a different deal. But the bottom line is, when I look back on that LSU team, it is becoming increasingly clear. Joe Burrow and Patrick Queen might have just been the greatest leaders in the history of college football, because 14 first-round picks that year, not first-round picks, 14 picks that year leads to a national championship. 10 this year at LSU leads to a 6-6 season. That tells me Joe Burrow was probably a pretty good leader. That tells me Joe Burrow, Patrick Queen, some of the other guys in that locker room did a good job of keeping guys in line in a way that did not happen after they left. Number 2, what I would also say, it really does show Ed Orgeron is like a historically great talent evaluator. Now, he's not a great head coach, but you look at all of the places that he's been. I mean, keep in mind, when he was at Ole Miss, he gets fired, and Houston not immediately has back-to-back 10-win seasons with the players that Ed Orgeron left. 2019, Ed Orgeron wins a national championship. 2020, obviously it's a COVID year, whatever. 2021, he goes 6-6 with 10 guys that were drafted in the NFL, plus, again, a bunch others down the road that are going to be NFL players. You know what that says to me? I don't know that I'd hire Ed Orgeron as a head coach. As a matter of fact, I know I wouldn't. But if you could get him in like a player personnel position, I would do that in half a second. I remember probably about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, I heard an interview with Ed Orgeron, and he was asked about, would you ever want to go back to LSU like as an assistant coach? And he said, I don't know about an assistant coach, but maybe. Who knows? If I was Lincoln Riley, and we're going to talk about Lincoln Riley in a minute with this Jordan Addison thing, first call I'm making, hey, Coach O, you want to run my personnel department? You want to be the guy that evaluates high school players? You want to be the guy that evaluates transfers? Because I believe that Ed Orgeron, while he's not a great head coach, probably has as good of an eye for talent as anybody that I can ever remember in college football. Finally, my third takeaway within the LSU takeaway, this is why Brian Kelly wanted to come to LSU. This is why Brian Kelly left Notre Dame. This is why Brian Kelly decided to leave as the winningest head coach in the history of that program to go to LSU. Notre Dame, we know what the limitations are. I feel bad, but it's the reality. It's really hard to win a lot of games at Notre Dame with the academic requirements, the fact that it's a small Catholic school in the middle of the Midwest where there just isn't a lot of high school football talent. Now he can go to Louisiana, to a program that just produced 10 NFL draft picks in a down year. Give Brian Kelly some time, man. I really think this, to me, tells me Brian Kelly can build a national champion and a consistent playoff contender at LSU. I know he's not the cultural fit, whatever. Give that guy the talent that Coach O had, he's going to have success. My number 4 takeaway from the NFL draft via college football. I said all year that this was not a vintage Alabama team, and the NFL draft bore it out. Now, I'll say this, that's not a criticism of Alabama. That's not saying Nick Saban underachieved. It's not saying he's losing his fastball. But I said all year, I said this is not a vintage Alabama team, and the draft proved it out. They only, and I'm using only in air quotes because 110 programs would love to only have 2 first-round picks, but Alabama only had 2 first-round picks this year. This after they set a record with 6 first-round picks a year ago. They had 8 of the first 38 players off the board last year, 6 first-rounders in 2021, and in 2020 they had 4 first-rounders, 5 of the top 35. This year, they only had 2 first-rounders, Evan Neal to the Giants, and, of course, Jamison Williams to the Lions. And overall, they only had 6 players drafted. So I told you all year, Alabama fans crush me. You don't know what you're talking about. I trust Coach Saban. And by the way, this might have been Nick Saban, one of Nick Saban's best coaching jobs. He gets his team to a national championship game, down John Mechie, his second-best wide receiver. Jamison Williams, his best wide receiver, gets hurt. Jalen Armour-Davis, a cornerback, is hurt. They have a couple O-linemen hurt. And he's still a couple plays away from winning a national championship. Don't forget that despite what the final score was, Alabama had the lead in the fourth quarter against Georgia. Georgia wins the national championship. This was one of Nick Saban's best coaching jobs. I told you all year, this wasn't a vintage Alabama team, and it was proven out. But what I'll also tell you this, that was the anomaly because, again, I started looking at 2023 NFL mock drafts. Alabama's going to be back in a big way this coming season. Bryce Young's going top 5. Will Anderson's going top 3 probably next year. Malachi Moore, a safety. Jordan Battle, a safety. Both guys projected to be early first-round picks. Eli Ricks, the cornerback, projected to be an early first-round pick, the transfer from LSU. So I hope you got your licks in on Alabama this past year. Really only Texas A&M and Georgia did. I know Auburn played them close. Arkansas played them close, whatever. It ain't going to be easy against Alabama going forward. They're going to be loaded next year, but I told you all year this was not a vintage Alabama team, and that bore itself out. Number 5, the Pac-12. I want to talk about the Pac-12 really quick because the Pac-12 had I'm losing the number right now, but what I've said about the Pac-12 for years is this. What I've said about the Pac-12 is the Pac-12 gets a bad rap. I don't think that the Pac-12 is the worst of the Power 5 conferences, even though they haven't had a playoff team in like 5 years. What I do think is that they haven't had that great program to kind of override the mess that the other programs are, right? Like I say it all the time. I think the Pac-12 is better across the board than the ACC. But the ACC has had Clemson at such an elite level for so many years that doesn't really matter how good Syracuse is or Boston College is or Miami's down or Florida State's down or how good's NC State because Clemson's so good it doesn't matter. It's been the same in the Big 12 with Oklahoma. Oklahoma's been carrying water for a lot of people, and I said the Pac-12 isn't as bad as you think. Just the problem is the fact that they don't have that great program that makes you forget about all the crap at the bottom of the league. Maybe USC will be that. We'll talk about that coming up with Lincoln Riley here in a minute. At the same time, that bared out in the NFL draft with the numbers. Because while the SEC had by far the most draft picks, 65 overall, the Big Ten had 48. The Pac-12 was next with 25, tied with the Big 12 for the most, and the ACC with 21. And so I'm not sitting here defending the Pac-12. I'm not saying that the Pac-12 is as good as the SEC. But what I've said for years is the Pac-12 isn't as bad as you think. It's just they don't have that frontline program to make you forget about everybody else. I think USC is going to get there. We're going to talk about Lincoln Riley. He's doing some sketchy stuff, but I'm just telling you, I actually think that the Pac-12 is better than people give it credit for. That bore out with the same number of picks as the Big 12. Finally, we talked about Georgia being a all-time great defense. Let's give a little credit to the Cincinnati Bearcats. 9 players drafted overall including Sauce Gardner, who went to the Jets in the top 10, Desmond Ridder, the quarterback. And what I would say is this. I'm not saying that Cincinnati is an all-time great team. That's not what I'm saying at all. But nine picks overall from a non-Power 5 team is the most for any non-Power Conference team since 1975. And so while Cincinnati clearly wasn't on the same level as Alabama, while Cincinnati would not have been able to hang with Georgia, what I can also tell you was they were deserving of being in that playoff based on what they did, who they did it against, and who the competition was. Clemson wasn't great this year. Ohio State wasn't great this year. LSU, Texas A&M, USC. There was no other team that deserved to be in over them. And what I see is that the talent at Cincinnati was kind of on par with everybody other than Georgia and Alabama. I'm not saying that they were definitively better than LSU. I think LSU had better personnel. But you combine coaching, personnel, depth, experience. Cincinnati was right up there, man. Cincinnati ended up with more players taken than Ohio State, more players taken than Michigan, more players taken than Penn State, more players taken than Alabama, more players taken than Oklahoma. You go on and on down the list. There aren't very many programs who had more players taken than Cincinnati. As a matter of fact, it was simply LSU and Georgia. Credit to the Cincinnati Bearcats. So those are my 6 takeaways from this NFL draft. Georgia, all-time great defense. Texas, most underachieving team. LSU, I don't know what happened there. The Pac-12, Alabama was not as good as they've historically been. And then finally, shout out to Cincinnati.